Welcome to today's In Union conversation, inspired by Race to Save the World. Union Chapel is proud to be hosting a special online screening of Race to Save the World, a documentary film from Joe Ganst that follows the inspiring stories of everyday people aged 15 to 72 who are devoting their lives to fighting climate change. My name is Michael Chandler. I'm the CEO of a Union Chapel project. For this conversation, I'm joined by Chris Garrard and Eden Rickson. Chris is a campaigner, researcher, and composer, and is co-director of the campaigns and research organisation Culture Unstained, which aims to end fossil fuel sponsorship of culture. He has a doctorate in music from the University of Oxford and has composed numerous pieces exploring environmental and political themes, such as his chamber opera, The Handmaid's Tale, based on Margaret Atwood's best-selling novel. In 2012, he co-founded Shell Out Sounds, a vocal ensemble that successfully campaigned for the end of Shell's sponsorship of the Shell Classic International concerts at London's South Bank Centre. In 2015, he was a music coordinator for Greenpeace UK's Requiem for Arctic Ice, a project involving a month-long series of performances taking place outside Shell's London HQ during the company's attempt to drill in the Arctic. Eden is a student, climate justice activist, and spoken word artist. She writes poetry for performance protests and is a member of Extinction Rebellion. She has been involved in major campaigns like the action that forced the Royal Shakespeare Company to drop their sponsorship from oil giant BP. She has worked with the mental health charity Mind and the Young Vic, and her protest poetry has featured in The Guardian and the Daily Mail. Thank you both so much for joining me today. How are you both?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Great, thank you for inviting us here.
And Chris, just very briefly, I know it's a particularly busy time for you and a particularly busy day. Can you elaborate on what you're actually dealing with live right now at this moment?
Yeah, so last week the Science Museum in London announced a new exhibition which is focusing on this controversial technology of carbon capture and storage. And it's something that needs to be talked about, but the fossil fuel industry really overhype it because it's a way they can say, oh, we're going to keep drilling for more oil and gas, but we'll somehow be able to deal with the emissions later on. We'll capture them somehow. But the big problem that has emerged is that Shell, the oil and gas company, is the major sponsor of that exhibition. And a whole load of scientists and people across social media are really unhappy about that. It's just totally unacceptable, and there's been this massive backlash, and so we're just trying to support people and really hold the Science Museum to account. It needs to, stand up for its independence and its scientific integrity, and that partnership just totally undermines it.
So this is very much a very live issue and a live conversation. So thank you again for joining us at what's probably a very busy day for you at the moment. I was going to start by launching into a few questions related to Race to Save the World, specifically the film. One of the things that struck me quite early on is there are a number of ways to be a climate activist, and some of the things featured in the film include breaking into tar sands area, to protests, to lobbying, to kayaktivists, which I thought was brilliant, to obviously walking the whole of the US to deliver a message to White House. In your experience, what are some of the tools, the techniques, the approaches that you two have been either used yourselves or been involved in?
Well, I think for me, using non-violent civil disobedience is such a powerful way to call power to account. And what that means is a non-violent form of protest that kind of disrupts business as usual. So it might be blocking a road, it might be causing damage to a property that's maybe associated with a corporation that might be polluting the planet in some way. And what I love about the kind of possibilities with non-violent civil disobedience is that you can be really creative in how you do that and how you call power to account. It doesn't just have to be just about blocking something. It could be that you use costume, or you use song, or you use movement, or you create a performance, or you do something that gives a visual and performative message, and also kind of gets to the core of someone emotionally. Because I think a lot of people maybe feel alienated from protest, or they don't feel safe enough to attend it. But if you can look at something that makes you realize the reality of climate change, and that talks to you on an emotional level, or that connects to you in a kind of beautiful way, then that might be what inspires you to take action and realize sort of the scale of the crisis we're in. So I think there's so many possibilities in how that can be done, and they're shown across the film as well.
Yeah, and I'd really echo that. So the Art Not Oil coalition that I'm part of, we've got these different groups who've used these different artistic approaches. So Liberate Tate were a group that used performance art interventions to get Tate to end its sponsorship by BP. I'm involved in BP or Not BP, and Eden has been as well. And we've used theatre and performance. We used to jump up on the stage at the Royal Shakespeare Company and use Shakespearean, kind of Shakespeare-inspired language to kind of subvert and challenge and talk about the ethics of those sponsorship deals. And I think there's a kind of utility in using art. It's a great way of delivering a message, but also, like Eden was saying, it touches people emotionally, and it opens up a space for questions, for not necessarily having to answer everything or resolve everything. And I think like one of the interesting things with this film is that it really does highlight some of the really important struggles. You mentioned the tar sands, sort of indigenous-led struggles, indigenous people's struggles, just in order to kind of protect their land. And that music and culture, they're not separate from resistance. They're not separate from protest. They're really, they are the resistance and the protest. And I think sometimes we have a notion of art as being separate from us or distinct from us, and actually it's just like it's a means through which we express ourselves and our resistance to things that are unjust.
Definitely, and I'd quickly jump in to add that like art is what gets us through crises, and times of like universal difficulty, and also like, you know, dance is what has literally kind of allowed civilization to function, and that's backed up by an amazing woman. I think her name is like Azakan Askin or something, but she researches on a really high level into how like dance and movement can help us save climate change, because moving together as a species and dancing and coming together in modes of performance has been integral to bonding us, and also allowing us to have a kind of resistance to power. So I would totally echo what Chris has just said about how actually like protest and resistance is not all seriousness. It is about the joy and the plethora of emotions and dance and movement and performance and song and all these things that go hand in hand with it. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I know you're both artists and you're both activists, and that is something that I wanted to talk about because, as you say, creativity in various forms comes up quite a lot in this film. And from documenting events to music as activism, that young man, RG, who is a musician himself as well. And we all know that art can be a great tool for social and political change. What you've mentioned some of your own work. What other examples of arts, culture, creativity have you seen that actually you thought either that you've been involved in, or you thought that has had a real impact, and why do you think that was? You've touched on some of that already, but I'm keen to hear more examples that people can go and have a look at as well.
Okay. Well, one amazing thing that happened last year that Chris coordinated and was involved in a lot more than me, but I just had the privilege of being able to go, was where BP or Not BP brought I think it was 20-foot big Trojan horse into the grounds of the British Museum, which was to protest against the fact that their latest exhibition at the time, it was called Troy, Myth and Reality, but it was sponsored by BP. And like that was such an amazing metaphor, because it's like BP is like the modern Trojan horse of today, because they present as this beautiful gift and they give money to arts and culture, but in the reality they're funding death and destruction. And also the British Museum is a very colonial site in that there's barely anything in it that's actually British. So that was an amazing example of how bringing that into the British Museum, the outdoor grounds, it enabled people coming to the museum to interact with this beautiful wooden horse that was huge and stunning and powerful and beautiful. And people were like, oh, what's this? And then you can start a conversation about the arts and culture in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you were just standing there. And one more quick example is also something that I think Chris was involved in, which was, I don't know if it was 1 or 2 years ago now, but it was against the BP Portrait Awards. And it was a protest where on the last day of the awards, the activists lay down in the room where the awards were happening, sort of almost naked, and then fake oil was poured all over their bodies as they curled up. And I did a piece of spoken word that I'd written as it was happening, sort of explaining why, like, art is the beginning but oil is the end, and it's so paradoxical to fund an exhibition that is about art and the continuation of humanity, fund that with a company that's funding the end of our world. It's just like, I think that was a really powerful example of how you can use the arts to touch people's, the vulnerability of bodies, to powerful point about the fragility of the state we're in, and also, like as Chris touched on, the kind of the fact that this is also tied to an Indigenous struggle as well. So yeah.
They're saying it sounds amazing. Chris, have you obviously you were involved in some of them as well? Any others that you've seen or been part of that you thought actually that was something?
To that performance protest that Eden mentioned with the bodies on the floor, the lovely thing about it is that there are these threads that weave between different kind of forms of expression and ideas and tropes and so on. And Liberate Tate had done this performance in the past inside Tate Britain that was this kind of naked body having oil poured in it. So this image returns throughout protest. And I think, so I went along to this overnight protest they did inside Tate Modern, and a group of us with charcoal transcribed onto that huge turbine hall floor inside Tate Modern passages of text from books about climate change, reports, quotations, so things like Naomi Klein. And we stayed there from high tide on one day right through the night, and we remained inside Tate Modern, and really to kind of call attention to BP's sponsorship of Tate. But it was the durational aspect. People know people like Marina Abramovich and people like this, and the use of durational performance. And it both had a value in terms of holding space, so like a kind of strategic thing in protest, that holding of space, but actually the effect it had to participate in it. The words, you didn't just read them, you knew them. You had felt them physically. You had felt the texture of the charcoal against the floor. You'd internalize them in a way that you wouldn't if you just sat down and read Naomi Klein's book or Margaret Atwood's book or whatever. And so, again, it was the creative expression that allows us to kind of really know that resistance in a very different way. And I think another group that I really admire is a group called Reverend Billy and the Stop Shopping Choir, who are based in New York. And they've basically got their own kind of amazing repertoire of songs, which are about consumerism, about climate change, and they're led by Reverend Billy, who is kind of based on a sort of Southern gospel preacher who evangelizes about stopping shopping, about leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And it's like a real kind of celebration of that resistance. If you go to one of their shows, you get up on your feet, you're singing along with them, and there's, again, something about the thrill, the leaning into that resistance and celebrating it together. And I think it's it's a very kind of clever thing to be able to bring people in, to be inclusive with your protest performance as well. It's a really important thing to do that.
Brilliant, thank you, both of you. And in terms of the the artistic process in creating these events, the activism that you're doing. Is there anything you can share about that? What's your starting point? Is it? I guess it's the issue itself, but then how do you get to a point of deciding or creating the event that you're about to do? Eden, do you want to go first, and then Chris?
Sure. I mean, I've been really lucky to kind of, I'd say I haven't started anything, to just sort of learn from the communities around me that are all wanting to make a difference and come in at different points. So it might be that someone says, oh, we're doing this action against this oil company, could you write some spoken word for it? Or that there's sort of conversations. But in terms of where it starts, yeah, I guess it's just being really aware of what is something that's happening right now. So for example, with Chris, it might be this science museum issue, something that's really live and that is in the news that you can take advantage of, and then do something so that visually and in a form of process you can then explore it.
I think it's quite a iterative process where you're constantly having to move between the kind of different places. Like if you'll often come up with a context or a campaign target or a situation, and that actually creates the sort of creative challenge as well. But I think the really important thing is to trust the process, trust the people you're working with. They're really valuable things, because the place you start out at is, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, it's going to look like this and do this, and you end up somewhere totally different. But you kind of have to trust each other and trust where that process is going to lead, and that the place you end up is going to be really rich and really valuable. And I think as part of that is also a kind of ethics and accountability. If we, particularly in like, I'm a white male doing activism in the UK, coming from that position of privilege, and often our groups aren't as representative as they need to be, is we then also need to think, how can we be accountable? How can we come up with these creative interventions that create space for other people's voices to be heard, or other perspectives, and create that platform? And maybe just as like a quick example, we did a performance once with a Colombian trade unionist, a guy called Gilberto Torres, who was trying to take legal action against BP in relation to human rights. And we did this very kind of humorous and comical performance with him, because he was like, I used to do theatre, this is great, this is absolutely what I want to do. And so it was really important, though, for us to like have that trust with him and have those conversations and make sure that that was appropriate for him and that worked for him. So it's also including people in that way.
Brilliant, thank you.
I'd quickly add to that as well, in that Chris is so right. It's important to think about what is the community you're trying to reach, and what is the community in whose space you're like residing when you do the protests. Because, for example, there was an action that was done by some members of Extinction Rebellion, I can't remember when, but it was in October, where they went on top of a tube in Canning Town and stopped the tube, and that kind of generated a lot of backlash, because like Canning Town is one of the most diverse and also working class boroughs in London, and obviously that's not going to hit the corporations, that's going to hit people trying to get to work and make a living. So that kind of action didn't take into account the community that is there and how to engage with them and do something ethically. But then at the same time, I'd also say I think it's so important to have a bold imagination and to go beyond our own, the limits of what we think our imagination is when we're planning actions, because I think we can feel like we live in quite a restrictive and oppressive society, but actually to think, well, no, we could do anything we want to and plan something really bold and creative. And like sometimes with Extinction Rebellion youth, if we're thinking of ideas, it's like, let's pour fake blood down here and then do this and da-da, and it kind of sounds crazy, but to be non-judgmental and open and really try to think about your imagination and what do you want to see and what could you try and do is so important. Because if you don't have that sort of freedom coupled with that awareness of ethics, then I don't think you'll get anywhere.
One of the other things that struck me in the film, and you've probably both got first-hand experience of this, is the sacrifice that a lot of the individuals make, whether it's sacrificing time with their families, and sometimes, some cases families splitting apart, to facing imprisonment. Are those kind of experiences familiar to yourselves? Are they familiar to people that you know? Is that part of the experience, for want of a different term? And should we all be making those kind of similar degree of sacrifice?
I think that's a really good question. And I think the important thing to say is that different things are kind of appropriate for different groups of people, and what they're able to contribute to a struggle. And it's not for any one person to say this is the way to resist, this is the way to participate in the movement. And like we were saying, the climate movement in the past has been very kind of quite restrictive and not diverse at all. And so I'm kind of cautious to say, oh, you need to come in and sacrifice yourself and give up your time by doing it this way, or put yourself at legal risk. Because actually, I think what the groups that both Eden and I have been involved in, you can do a whole range of creative things that tap into your personal tastes and interests and energies, and that's where we've got to begin from. I think the flip side of that is when I think about Indigenous communities who are on the front lines resisting tar sands infrastructure, when I think of like the Stansted 15 who put their bodies on the line to stop a deportation flight, to me these are a really incredible people who, because that's not something that I've done, and I think it takes a certain level of courage. But I think there's also like a real, I mean, I love the activism I do. It takes a lot of work and hours in the day. I get to work with great people. I'm super grateful for that. But I'm also under no illusions that that's a radically different kind of sacrifice of my time and days to if you're a community on the front lines of this. And I think that's also why as a person from a position of relative privilege, it's important to like show up and act where I can. And yeah.
Eden, what about yourself? Have you been in positions of, or challenging positions in those kind of situations?
Yeah, I also think it's a really interesting question, and I'm also quite aware of my privilege in the Western world, and as someone that hasn't been affected by climate change yet. And like Chris, I sort of think the what I do in my activism using the arts is a very different kind of sacrifice compared to the people that are on the front line of climate emergency, or even the people that are defending the woodlands that are planning to be felled for HS2, or doing all kinds of things that use their bodies or that directly have to try and stop climate change that's happening now. But I would say that, like, at my age, it does feel like a lot of pressure to have to be thinking about the collapse of our civilization at 20 years old. And also because COVID has affected the whole world, I do feel like, if I'm really honest, like, whoa, there's a lot to be kind of holding as a young person, because, like, for example, I'm trying to party, but then I'm like, oh gosh, but this plastic cup, why can't it be a biodegradable or reusable one? Or like, so I think there's a lot to hold. But like I say, I'm so aware of how privileged I am, but also, like Chris, how it's so important not to sit on that privilege or be ashamed of it or afraid of it, rather to say, right, I've got this, how can I use it, how can I listen, how can I learn, and how can it best be of use? But I just wish that more people with even more resources, like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or whatever, realize that, actually, like we were saying earlier, carbon capture isn't this amazing technological thing. It's actually just listening to Indigenous people and planting more trees and, supporting frontline people and then redistributing their wealth. But anyway, don't know how we got onto wealth redistribution, but I'm going to stop talking.
It always comes up eventually. And there's a direct call on Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk in there as well. But you mentioned something there, Eden, which I've also been thinking about, partly as a result of this film, but also because I have a son, well, two sons, and one of them who's not yet 7, but is clearly very anxious about the environment. And I wondered for yourselves, and obviously being at the front line, if you want, of activism on climate change, how do you manage your mental health and your resilience in the face of what is such an alarming situation, and in many cases a very frustrating one? What are you doing, and what would you say to others that are either are involved in climate activism or are thinking about it, that, you know, this is a tough old slog, if you like. This is how to take care of yourself.
There's a reason why it's creative. Well, there are two reasons why it's like creative activism that I've been drawn to. Like, one, that was the thing I started out doing, but there was something about the like aptness, the like oppositionalness of me with a placard, or that kind of thing. And that's also not knocking the role of showing up to a protest with a placard, because it's like super important. But to sing together, to perform together, like I was mentioning Reverend Billy in the Stop Shopping Choir, like to sing with people and express the the, the things that you're feeling, and express your resistance in those creative ways, I think is actually a really important part of it. And the trust and the intimacy that comes from working with a group of people who are feeling those same things, or trying to process these kind of huge challenges as well. That solidarity is like very special, and is very kind of unique to those groups in a way. And then I think I have, like, I think a lot of people do it, but more personally, is to go back and read the incredible people like uh, Adrienne Marie Brown and James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, and people who challenge you and also reassure you and provoke you, and those things I think can feed your activism, you know. And musicians, and like, who are the musicians and artists that inspire and feed your like creative thinking and your like radical energies, and like find out who they are and keep tapping into it, because that's not going to go away. That's an endless kind of resource, and we, you know, like, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them.
Brilliant. Eden, any additional recommendations, thoughts
Well,
about your
first of
own
all,
releasing? Sorry, go on.
no, that was beautiful, Chris. I'm going to be stealing that because I need those tips too. But yeah, I think I would say remembering that you are here for the long haul rather than the short term, because it's very easy to burn out and do too much and become so overwhelmed by the scale of the ecological crisis and the people suffering now, that you actually can't be of any use because you're so worried about that and overwhelmed and upset that in the spaces and times that you're needed, your creativity can't be of use. So I'd say making sure that you realize there's only what you can only do what you can do, and whatever that is in whatever way is so important, because we have to have all kinds of different people coming at this from all sides in different forms of activism, which is a beautiful thing. But yeah, remembering that there's only maybe one way that you can take action for a certain amount of your life, which is okay. And I think, kind of like Chris said, remembering that you're standing on the shoulders of giants and all the people that have come before you and face the same kind of struggle, and finding art that speaks to you on that, whether it's poetry or music or plays or whatever. And I think also, like, just at least for me and for other young people, remembering that like we were also put onto this earth to feel joy and celebration and like powerful, beautiful emotions, and so to remember that it's just as important to sit and like brainstorm actions and protest. It's also important to dance and to have fun and to find resistance in the joyful and celebratory and communal moments. So yeah, I think it's really about that, and also turning off your phone.
We should all turn off our phone more often, for sure. It sounds like there's such a resilience and solidarity and resistance. And I, from previous experience, I know that is the case. So what can and should other artists, other arts organisations, even arts venues such as Union Chapel, what should we all be doing more of to address the climate emergency?
So, I mean, there's a whole range of things, and I think the thing or the way that I would love to see the cultural sector go is more towards climate justice. So people talk about climate action and they think about recycling, which is great. They think about their operational impact, reducing the carbon footprint, etc. The concept of carbon footprint, by the way, was something invented by BP in order to try and think the responsibility lay with us as individuals rather than them, an oil company, and changing the system as well. But what I mean by this is that I think it's really important cultural institutions declare a climate emergency. So there's this culture declares emergency movement, but that's the start of a process. And that should lead cultural organisations and artists to then thinking about who am I working with? Who am I speaking to with my work? Who's am I creating a platform for? And why is it that I want to reduce my carbon footprint? Like, which communities do I want to be in solidarity with or in support of? And so then when it comes to this issue of oil sponsorship, there's very few cultural institutions now that still take oil money. So the British Museum is still sponsored by BP. The Science Museum is actually sponsored by three oil and gas companies, BP, Shell and Equinor. And they're really kind of holding the sector back. They're outliers now. And we've seen universities, local authorities divest from fossil fuel companies. So the next logical thing is for the cultural sector to kind of cut those ties. And the reason that's important, like sometimes it might seem, well, we wouldn't take money from a BP or a Shell, but to participate, to say these institutions aren't representing us as a sector is really important. It changes the space in which the conversation is happening. It makes those companies realize that having business plans that aren't going to get us where we need to be, it just isn't acceptable. It crosses the line. And I think sometimes we don't always realize how powerful the culture sector is, the strength of its voice. And I'm not going to remember who said the quote, but that famous quote about the easiest way we give up our power is the belief that we don't have any, that we have none. And so actually I think the cultural sector can, the power of declaring a climate emergency, the power of just really exploring how do we embed climate justice into all aspects of our work, from finance to what we program to who we invite in to our venues, our institutions.
That's brilliant. I mean, and just to say on behalf of Union Chapel, this event that we're hosting is just the beginning of our work around climate justice, and we've already been doing some. So this is something obviously we're very committed to, and I just wonder, and I wonder if it's a concern you might have, Chris, that following the pandemic, the number of arts organisations that are going to be facing financial crisis and are desperate to survive, do you think there's any risk that more organisations might start taking funding from oil companies, or do you think actually the progress has been made there? That risk is relatively low. A lot of organisations now have those ethical funding processes or policies in place, or what have you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the ethical ground has shifted. I think people feel that ethical red line has shifted. But in saying that, I think just want to make a really clear distinction that there are lots of front of house workers, curators, arts, cultural sector workers who have had an extremely difficult time, who have lost jobs, who have been made redundant, in many cases unfairly made redundant as well. And that's really important that at the same time that we do want these changes, that we are expressing our sort of support and solidarity for them. And that the kind of climate leadership in like I say, these very few institutions, it's like the British Museum and the Science Museum, who actually are in that much more privileged position, funding-wise, is still a challenge, but they are in a much more fortunate position. They can demonstrate that climate leadership, that ethical leadership. And it sits with them, and we need to kind of look to the directors and the boards of those institutions to shift direction as well. So but I think that highlights a really important thing, is that it's important we're joined up in our struggles as well, that the struggle for climate justice isn't separate from the struggle for racial justice or for workers' rights, and we need to work together. These things need to be connected.
Very good, thanks, Chris. And Eden, for yourself, and any reflections for other artists? What should artists do or be saying at the moment, do you think?
Well, I think if you're educated on climate change, then being really bold and clear when you're in a theatre space, constantly asking questions like, well, why do we need to buy that set? Let's make sure it's recycled. Or where's that coming from? Do you know who made this thing you're proposing we buy? Like constantly questioning and making sure that you're checking the processes happening in the theatre space. And also, I think just that awareness that you might make a play that's about climate change and explores the themes of, I don't know, climate or racial or social justice, and yet it might be a really wasteful production, and it might actually still be enforcing oppression in the way it was made by, I don't know, ordering loads of wood that was chopped down in another country and then exported miles and miles and miles, or it might be oppressive in the way that the people that are employed didn't reflect the diversity it should. So I think it's about asking the questions of, well, in making this play that might have a progressive message, are we actually also being oppressive in the way we're creating it? And if so, how can we try as a company to not do that? And it's really hard because so many people making theatre are on a shoestring and just want to get work out. And especially after the pandemic, the drive to just get stuff made as cheaply as possible is going to be really strong. But I think, if you have that education and that willingness, then it's about constantly asking questions, holding the space that you're in accountable, and if you can, calling power to account, and those people higher up saying, hey, why have we not got, for example, rules about the amount of carbon, I guess, that we could use in a year, or how everything should or shouldn't be recycled, or whatever it is, and taking it as a real opportunity for huge imagination. Again, like there's an amazing designer called Rosie Alney, I believe, and she's made a really amazing online piece called Prayer, where she wanted for 6 weeks, rather than to rehearse a play, to get a company of actors and a creative team to plant a garden, because the word rehearse actually means to rake over soil. And so she was like, why can't we for 6 weeks, a rehearsal process, just see what happens if we tried to plant a garden together and grow it, and then share that with the audience. And I thought that was amazing. And the idea, it's just something so simple, but so kind of creative, and something that would work with the community, and literally say, right, let's kind of, in a way, do some carbon capture right here by planting. So that's just an example of something that I loved.
Brilliant. One final and fairly brief question for you both. One of the things that's been on our minds and is a concern of ours at the Union Chapel is around the police crime bill, and the potential impact of that, not just on activism and protesting, but obviously also on specific groups such as Gypsy and Traveller communities and homeless community. What's your thoughts, feelings on that at the moment? Any sense of the impact that might have on your work and your plans?
Yeah, I think in short, it's a deeply concerning bill. It shouldn't be passed. I mean, it's so transparent to everyone that's encroaching upon the space for freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. And I think it's, again, this is where solidarity and collaboration between groups comes in. But I think in saying that, just to pay tribute maybe to the group Sisters Uncut, who in the aftermath of the murder of Sarah Everard, really kind of mobilised around this issue, and I think woke up a lot of other groups, and also the Network for Police Monitoring as well. And I think it's just really important to acknowledge where the work is being done. And I think if you want to support this or get involved, I think they're two of the groups to go and look up as well.
Definitely. I also think it's a really dangerous bill, and I'm just sort of shocked by it, because I think the police have far enough powers as it is to do what they want and shut down protests. And it scares me that it means that activism will become even more sort of dangerous for a lot of groups and minorities that might not feel that they can take to the streets for whatever reason, or because obviously the police have a history of not protecting people of colour, that kind of thing. So I worry that it will make activism even more exclusionary and unsafe, which is such a sort of injustice to me, because so many of the rights that we have now, like the right to vote, and the civil rights movement, that those are struggles that all come from protest and civil disobedience. Or a gay marriage is another one. And so some of the politicians that have backed this bill and yet say they have the right to vote or whatever it is, I'm like, how do you not realize that it's the same thing? So yeah, very angry about it.
One final thought then from both of you, for people that are watching, anything that they can do to get involved, or any recommendations that you have for them for the future?
Maybe I'll be cheeky. I'll go for two super short things.
Go
So
for it.
the first one is there's currently a petition out there calling on the Science Museum to drop that sponsorship deal with Shell. And I think there's always a lot of petitions, but even small kind of interventions like that help, and that would be amazing. And secondly, if you've got a limited amount of time and you've watched this and you're interested, look up the things that we've talked about or interested in, but actually go and look up Indigenous Climate Action or the Indigenous Environmental Network or the Goni People's Struggle in the Niger Delta against Shell, or look up those groups in the Global South that you might not know about. Challenge yourself to go and find the groups that aren't on your radar, that aren't in your circle. I think that's more important than anything we're doing. So yeah.
Yeah, and coming from a sort of social media perspective, I'm just thinking about some amazing intersectional people that really inspire me. So if you have Instagram, I'd say follow the Intersectional Environmentalist. I'd say follow Climate in Colour, which is an amazing network run by a woman called Jocelyn, who's studying her PhD in AI and decoloniality. Like, how amazing is that? And she does loads of incredible infographics all about kind of climate justice, and particularly the experience of people of colour navigating that field. I'd also just name drop an amazing person in the field of both the arts and acting and activism. He's called Fainty Balogun, and he's amazing. He's doing some work with complicity in these exact areas, and how do we merge the arts and all its richness with the complexity and sort of severity of the climate crisis, particularly in the context of if you're a person of colour and, for example, protest is not safe for you. And he articulates some of these ideas and is exploring them. So I'd say check him out. I can't really think of anything else right now, but thanks so much.
Wonderful recommendations. Thank you both. And just to add, one of the other interviews that we're doing alongside the Race to Save the World digital screening is with the CEO of Oxfam, particularly talking about the impact of the climate crisis on the Global South. So that is one of the other conversations that we're having as part of this mini season, if you like. Chris, Eden, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And for joining us, and some wonderful recommendations there. We'll send and share links to your work directly as well. But yeah, thank you very much.